Hello, and welcome to the Fiction Nonfiction podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm V.V. Ganeshananthan, the author of the novel Brotherless Night.
And I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant. We're both teachers and we're both writers, and we talk about the politics of writing and literature. That's what the podcast does, but we don't very often talk about like our past and how we became or learned to do what we do. And I was wondering, did you have like a really important, influential teacher when you were not college? We've talked about McPherson, but like when you were younger, like in middle school or high school.
Yeah, I think I was lucky to have so many amazing teachers, but I do think very often about a music teacher I had who passed away, a guy named Frankie Ball, who was from Texas and who played the trumpet and who taught me how to play the saxophone, and who I think just really kind of broadly imparted a lot of great lessons about kind of discipline, the discipline of like sitting down to, if you love something, you're going to sit down and do it every day. Um, and in his opinion, you're going to do it with good posture. So
Oh,
I don't know. He was huge. He was huge fun. I mean, he spent extra time so that, a bunch of middle schoolers who really wanted to be cool could be in jazz band. And I think, he imparted a lifelong love of music to a lot of us. And then when he was ill at the end of his life and was retiring, we all went back to our middle school and did a tribute concert for him. And he
oh,
saw me
that's
and was like,
nice.
Sugi. And I was like, he remembers me, which was such a great moment. How about you? Who was your favorite teacher?
I definitely had a lot of really good teachers, but I do had a particular teacher, a guy named Ed Quigley, who was an English teacher, but also my soccer coach, who I have a lifelong relationship with. I still have a relationship with. We hunted together later after school. I mean, after I was long past being a graduate, and it's been an incredibly important role model in my life in many ways, or a mentor, really would be the right word, I think. And the thing is, like, you see people, there's a lot of criticism of education and teachers, and that, like they don't teach the right thing, and I feel like it's sad because teachers can have such an incredibly important role in the development of students. They're so generous. They're so, uh, I don't even know the right word, you know? But I feel like we don't think about them enough.
Well, today we're going to spend some more time thinking about them, and we're going to do that in the company of educator and novelist Brian Platzer. Brian is the author of the novels Bed-Stuy is Burning and The Body Politic, as well as the nonfiction parenting guide Taking the Stress Out of Homework. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, New York Magazine, the New Republic, and he's also known for his humor pieces in the New Yorker's Shouts and Murmurs column, as well as in McSweeney's. He teaches English in Manhattan. He's a CNN contributor on education, and he's a co founder of Teachers Who Tutor NYC. And he's joining us to talk about his new novel, The Optimists, which centers on a teacher. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm such a fan. I've been really looking forward to this.
The Optimist is well, okay. In its simplest sense, this is a book about a relationship between a teacher, Mr. Keating, and his student Clara Hightower. But you dedicated this novel to a real teacher, Rod Keating, who was your teacher when in like seventh and eighth grade. Am I right about that? And
That's
mentored you
exactly
when you
right.
began teaching eighth grade English. Could you talk about this guy? How did his teaching influence your life? Was he a fan of knock knock jokes, like the fictional Mr. Keating?
Yeah, I mean, I can get to the knock knock jokes piece first, and then go back to tell you about the man. He was not a fan of knock knock jokes, but he
Okay.
was so multifaceted and such a performer, and brought so much to the table as a teacher, that I felt like I needed a way to recreate that in fictional form. So he had all of these, eccentricities and performative ticks and techniques that are harder to capture on the page than I realized. So when I found this sort of knock knock joke trope as a way to introduce him to the reader, I felt like that was as close to the real Mr. Keating as I could get without him in front of the reader. In terms of the man, I mean, I was 12, 13 when I was in seventh grade, and he was the first teacher who almost broke the form for me. Like but before then there were teachers and I tried to please them and I tried to get good grades or I tried not to be yelled at or whatever it was. And then all of a sudden there was this guy who commanded the room and didn't just give us information that we were going to regurgitate back to him, but made a performance out of teaching. And it was a little bit embarrassing and a little bit scary and thrilling. And it made me realize that there was like this real human being who was a teacher who could make decisions that day based on the students in his classroom and what they felt they needed to learn. He could get to know us, and he visually changed the way he was teaching based on how we responded to his prompts and reacted to him. And it blew my mind at the time. I remember being 12, 13, 14, thinking like, oh, this is a human person, man, who is in the room with me, who is going to try to teach something that he deeply cares about. And it changed my life. And it made me realize that these books were something that you could sincerely love as opposed to pretend you love for the sake of a teacher. And, when I graduated from my MFA and I was in New York City trying to figure out how to get healthcare and pay rent, he had been in touch and he said, hey, like I could probably shoehorn you back in here for a class or two. And I had been, off teaching college and thought never would I want to be back in middle school land. And I fell in love with it. And then I got to meet him again, where he was my mentor this time, and he was showing me how to approach teaching, how to approach my students. And it was an internship, a master class where I got to learn from him, as a teacher after learning from his as a student all those years before.
I had a mentor like that, a guy named Ed Quigley, who was my like probably starting in junior year though. He was my soccer coach though, so he coached me from my freshman year through. And he was like the I think there's something special about a teacher who's like can be funny. He didn't tell knock knock jokes, but he was funnier than the students. So if students tried to act up, he would be funnier than them and make them look stupid. And I was like, okay, this is a smart guy. And then he also genuinely cared about literature. I mean, he taught
Yeah.
Ulysses. He had a semester long class where you were going to read Joyce's Ulysses, and everyone took it because he was fun to be with, and it felt like you were doing something important. The idea that literature is an important thing came to me from him, really.
And just seeing somebody whom you respect take something so seriously. I think the job of a teacher, especially in this sort of late middle school, high school level, to just model what it looks like to be a human being who cares deeply about thinking and books, that in and of itself can be invaluable, regardless of the pedagogy behind it.
Did you find that when you began teaching, you were imitating him? I mean, in a sense of sometimes I find that when I'm teaching, I'm like, oh
Yeah.
my gosh, I just turned into one of my favorite teachers.
In the very beginning, yes. And actually, he was one of the first ones to say, like, don't do an impersonation of any of your teachers. I mean, I think he knew he was being euphemistic. Like he's like, you need to find like what makes you like interact with the students in the way you feel like they will get the most value. And that, chastened me because I felt like he was criticizing, what I was doing, but it also opened up the world to me because it made me realize that what made him great wasn't the specific routine he had prepared, but it was showing his students an honest version of himself. And that's what I had been doing wrong and then began to figure out how to do better.
So, all of this, of course, aim towards this flexible, wild, changing student body. And in the novel, Mr. Keating is focusing on a particular student, Clara. And why is Clara so fascinating to him? And why did you think that her arc could best be understood through the lens of her teacher rather than, say, Clara telling the story? How did you come to that place?
Well, I think his perspective is really important in terms of answering that question, where he's at the very end of his life. He has suffered a stroke, his wife is struggling, and he is trying to get a handle on how to tell a story that felt honest to him, that felt the most important to him. And the intensity with which he felt, the story of his wife would be, or trying to explain, his own struggles and suffering is almost too much for him to deal with. So in looking at the palette, the framework of his life, I think he feels the most comfort in trying to tell the story of his most extraordinary student. And through that story, he's able to brag a little bit about his own, experience as a teacher without feeling as though he's bragging. So what I want the reader to experience is I want the reader to feel as though, yes, he's telling Clara's story, and Clara is an objectively special student. She's people gravitate towards her. She's intellectually smart. She's ambitious. She's different, but the story of Clara at that moment is as much about Mr. Keating wanting to burst through at these end moments of his life and say, like, this is why I, Rod Keating, am important. I'm humble, I'm bashful, I don't want to tell you my life story. And the closest I can get is tell you about how extraordinary this student is. And it's almost a way of him saying, like, look, my life matters, and it matters because I taught these hundreds of students, and of the students I taught this one special one, and let me tell you about her. And then he keeps on interrupting the story about her to say, and at that point in my life I was doing this, and my wife, whom I love dearly, thought this. And but he feels like he needs to go back to the story of Clara over and over again, because at least there's a plot to her life. There's a wanting to
Well,
know what's going to
yeah,
happen next.
I think he misunderstands the story he's telling, and I mean, first person narrators don't
Exactly
always
right.
know what they're doing. He says at one point, "I've chosen to tell Clara's story because I don't know how to explain my own." And then he also says, "Clara is the closest I've come to greatness." Now, that last statement, I totally disagree with, and I bet that you, the author, would also. In fact, it seems to me like the what he's discovering, or maybe what he's showing to us without being able to understand it himself, which is important, is that the greatness of him is his relationship with the people around him. That it lasts with these students and people beyond the classroom, and he has all these other characters who are actually really close to him and influenced by him, like Jacob and Enid and his wife Carolyn, who you mentioned earlier. Could you introduce us to those characters and talk about their role in the story?
Yeah, sure thing. And I appreciate you saying that, because I think it's exactly right. I think that he misunderstands his own narrative because of how uncomfortable he is in trying to articulate the details of his relationship with these other characters. So the three you mentioned, you have Jacob, who shares his fascination with Clara. Jacob's in love with Clara, and a lot of the plot of the book is a will they or won't they, Jacob being in love with Clara, and sometimes there's reciprocity, sometimes there's not. And I think one of the reasons why Mr. Keating is so attuned and excited about Jacob is they share their passion about the school and learning and the complicated meanings behind life and humor and all that. But they're also both fascinated by Clara, and being able to tell Jacob's story is another angle into trying to figure out who this extraordinary girl turned woman is. Um, Enid is a an ex girlfriend of Mr. Keating's, has been working at this school for as many years as he has, and they both have an ambivalence about what it means to teach at a New York City independent school, and they share a sort of wry sensibility and a search for trying to figure out where meaning comes from. And I think that Enid is an artist and is more willing to say, like, my art is what matters to me. Whereas Mr. Keating really wants his students to matter to him. I think that the cleanest, easiest way that he can articulate the meaning in his life is through his students, which is why he focuses on Clara in the way that you're saying. And then there's his wife, Caroline, who is too important to him to be able to talk about, almost, where he's overwhelmed by her meaning in his life, her importance, first as a sex interest, then as a love interest, then as a wife, and then at the end of his life as a caretaker of him. And it's too much for him to contend with, trying to figure out how to talk about such intense emotions. So he tells it slant a little bit, and becomes a storyteller of this other character about whom he feels like he can fully grasp the narrative.
Brian, there's a gorgeous passage in the book that's addressing basically right what you're saying, and I wonder if you'd read it for us.
Yeah, it'd be my pleasure. I believe it's considered unsophisticated these days to quote Hemingway on literature or life, But he was onto something when he put into the mouth of a character in The Sun Also Rises that if you talk about something, you lose it. How do you describe a happy marriage? The first time Caroline and I got drunk together after closing at the bookstore, or even better, the first time she didn't charge me for a book, a glance at her collarbone. But all that's in courtship, not marriage. Writing about courtship after 25 years of marriage is superficial, paltry, unworthy, and our marriage is too subtle. How can I write about Caroline after everything she's ever done for me and with me and have not that been have I'm going to take that again. Actually, can I take this whole thing again? I stumbled
Sure,
over the
it's
beginning and it
fine.
didn't sound right. Sorry. I believe it is considered unsophisticated these days to quote Hemingway on literature or on life. But he was onto something when he put into the mouth of a character in The Sun Also Rises that if you talk about something, you lose it. How do you describe a happy marriage? The first time Caroline and I got drunk together after closing at the bookstore? Or even better, the first time she didn't charge me for a book? A glance at her collarbone? But all that is courtship, not marriage. Writing about the courtship after 25 years of marriage is superficial, paltry, unworthy, and our marriage is too subtle. How can I write about Caroline and everything she's ever done for me and with me and have that not be a disappointment to her? I couldn't bear it. I can't even write her an anniversary card. To put my feelings into writing, I love you. You make my life worth living. That's not exactly right. I love you. You are my life. That's closer. My life is yours. That's closer still. Tolstoy wrote that all happy families are alike, and every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. That part about happy families never felt true to me. Better was his line about how loving someone meant loving them just as they were, not the way you wanted them to be. Caroline is the only person I've ever known to love me as the adult I am, which is how I do my best to love her. But try to put that into a scene, use the camera method, show her taking a washcloth off the stack, warming and soaping up the water, rolling me into the bathroom, undressing me as a parent undresses a child, or as a child undresses a doll, dipping the cloth into the water. She feels my body shiver, even though I can't feel it. Mark Twain wrote something about marriage, making two fractional lives a whole, which seems true. Enid understood what Twain was getting at when she talked about needing to create a family in order to be happy. But that wholeness is not the stuff of literature, or if it belongs in literature, it's for sonnets, not novels. Marriage, when its participants are healthy at least, is the stuff of daily life, the stuff that matters. The lentil soup, the do you want to shower first or should I? The bad night's sleep, the glass of water, the taste of her mouth's kiss. My life with Clara had a plot. My life with Caroline was something bigger, more amorphous, shapeless, and all-encompassing.
Thank you very much. Um, the other character that there's an interesting part about the teachers. I feel like I had not taught in high school, but I there's like if you have an intense relationship with a student, there's a kind of parenting that's happening, right? I mean, I felt like Ed Quigley was in a way parenting me, right? But and I appreciated that and I needed that. On the other hand, he's not my parent. So there's this quasi world that you have to sort of negotiate how that and then the student can just walk away from you, like, which is the pain for teachers, which you can't do with parents. And so Mr. Keating has this intense relationship with Jacob, and I think he thinks of him almost as a son, but he's not his son. And I wonder if you could just talk about that element of the novel.
Yeah, for sure. So it's a little bit even more intense for Mr. Keating and Jacob because Jacob's mom, Enid, was an ex of Mr. Keating's, and Mr. Keating knew Jacob as a young boy. So he feels responsible is too strong a word, but he feels like he has the opportunity to mold and shape and point in the right direction, and he takes that opportunity seriously. There's a moral seriousness, there's a familial seriousness, and you see moments of excitement where Mr. Keating feels like he can advise Jacob in one direction or another. but also there's an anxiety there that Mr. Keating doesn't want to mess it up. And when he gets too close to Jacob, when the two of them as adults are hanging out in a bar and talking about life and talking about Clara, it's very exciting for Mr. Keating because he feels like he has a sincere relationship, almost at equals with Jacob in that moment. But simultaneously, he feels like I don't want to have this go wrong. I don't want to hug him if maybe that's not what he wants from me. Because the role is this sort of liminal role where it's the role of a mentor, of a parent, of an equal, and I think that's part of what's so different in the parent-child relationship from the teacher-child relationship, where a parent will always be a parent to the child, where the teacher can go through a transition, in the relationship with the student, and I felt that personally with the real Mr. Keating, where I went from being, you know, intimidated by him and wanting good grades to being intimidated by him and wanting to please him in the classroom to at the end of his life, coming over weekly and he had a massive stroke and couldn't communicate in real life. And I went over to his house and I read to him and I cared for him. And there was a transition there. And I think that relationship, one, there's a lot of responsibility that we put on teachers to navigate that in a healthy, safe, caring way. Um, and I wanted Mr. Keating to be very aware of that, as I wanted the reader to be very aware of that. And two, the fact that there can be someone who needs to please you for these formal reasons, as a teacher, and then as that person gets older, who can turn into a real friend of yours, I think is a complicated, wonderful, under-examined relationship in life and in literature.
Thinking about these students and going back to Clara for a moment and thinking about how she moves away, right? She gets into Dalton, another
Yes.
expensive private school, and then goes on to become a Silicon Valley celebrity entrepreneur and several more turns past that. And Mr. Keating remains so
You went to
constant. And then
Dalton, but you
Claire,
seem to skip the Silicon Valley part. What happened there?
I went to Dalton. I seem to have skipped a lot of experiences that other
Okay,
Dalton
sorry,
kids
I interrupted Stevie's
experience
question. I
at
just
at Dalton. But yeah, we can do our next podcast can all be about
okay.
the wonders and terrors of the Dalton
Well, no,
School on
we're
the
gonna
Upper East
get
Side of
there. We're
Manhattan.
gonna get there.
how did you imagine Clara's trajectory? And yeah, Mr. Keating, the constant, and Clara changing and changing and changing.
That's a great question. I mean, I left probably 200 pages of Clara on the cutting room floor. The first draft of the novel had, a blow by blow, a play by play of her going from high school to college to, achieving in Silicon Valley to abandoning it and working at a farm. I had 40 pages of her living a farm life and returning back to New York after that. And then I just decided that wasn't the point. Like Mr. Keating decides very quickly that she is extraordinary for a relatively silly, superficial reason where he has this test that matters the world to him, and she takes the test and aces it. And in his mind, he's like, she did it. And not only did she do it, like I did it. Like I created this brilliant test that defined this brilliant person. And then he sits back and watches. Whereas the head of school is obsessed with Clara for a different reason. He feels like Clara can become famous and then he can fundraise off Clara and one day this school can be as significant culturally as Dalton because of Clara. And I wanted Mr. Keating's relationship with Clara to be steadier and healthier and almost rooting her on in a world where Jacob wants her for himself. He wants to possess her in a love relationship, and Richie, the head of school, wants Clara as a way to boost his own ego and legacy. Where Mr. Keating wants Clara to succeed because he feels, you know, close to her. He cares for her, but also he wants his students to succeed because in his mind, that's what a good teacher is, and that's what success, professional life, professional success for him is to have 100, 1,000 Claras out there, living the life that he, nudged them trajectory wise forward into.
Uh, th- th- there's a connected element of this here. I mean, I've already said, like, I really feel like she's just one point on the markers of doing really a portrait of Mr. Keating. And there have been many teacher student, media, whether films or novels, for good reason. It's a great subject. But this one is, and like, I was thinking of Rushmore, I watched recently with my 15-year-old
Sure.
son, which is a great movie, but very different than this one, than your book. Or what's the classic one that everyone, the Robin Williams Dead Poets Society? I haven't seen
Yep.
that in a long time. I don't know how I would feel about it if I saw it again. Those always focus on what the teacher's doing in the classroom, right? But this book, unlike your first book, your novel Bed-Size Burning, which takes place in a single day, this book covers a long span of time beyond his teaching years, right? Which makes it unique to me among teaching novels, and that's another signal to me that you're like trying to get a sense of the whole shape of this guy's life and the way that he affects students after he's done teaching them, which is not often written about.
That's right. I mean, I think a couple things you made me think about based on that question. One is most of the teachers whom we read about and see are bad teachers. Like if you look, they're sort of grandstanding
Yeah.
performers, or they're sexual assaulters, or they're, you know, uh, uh, egomaniacs, or whatever it is. And I I wanted to demonstrate that not only is Mr. Keating a pretty good teacher, but he's a man living a life. And at the end of his life, he is wheelchair bound. He is trying to figure out what story he can tell to get himself across to his audience, which might only be his wife at this point. He doesn't know. He hopes the audience will be bigger than that. And I think his point in all of this is that his job isn't to entertain in the moment. Entertaining in the moment is a way to set his students off on this far, far, far longer trajectory. So to just, go with, Aristotle's unities or whatever it is, and to put him, in a one day of his life, and to show the magic that can exist, but the spark between parent and not parent, between teacher and student, like that's valuable, but that's 10% as valuable as the full trajectory of like setting a student up, pointing him or her in a certain direction, and then watching the next 20, 30, 40 years occur where you get to see like, yes, maybe I wasn't the most important person in the world to this student, but I did point her in the right direction, and I can sit back and I can try to watch and applaud and be excited, and then think, you know what, like I had a little bit to do with this. And yes, he could have told that story probably about a dozen or 100 different students, but choosing one and having it matter so profoundly to him was a way that he is telling his wife and the reader, but mostly himself, like I, Rod Keating, mattered. My
Yeah.
life matters. And doing that on a larger scale, I think is the only way that it can approach trying to get that across to, yeah, the reader, to his
I mean, he
wife, but to
counsels Jacob on
himself.
his other relationships, after Clara, and then so he's staying with this young man throughout his life in many ways, right? And it just has the lasting effect is very evident there.
That's exactly right. And I just think it's when I was with him at the end of his life, the, he was in a wheelchair. He couldn't communicate. For this book, I invented a fictional way for him to communicate, but in real life, he couldn't tell any stories. And I became obsessed with this idea of like, what is he actually thinking about? What does he
Oh
want to
man.
say that he can't? And he's, in real life before that, so he was polylingual. He would read multiple novels a week. He became a reverend to marry me to my wife. He delivered a beautiful ceremony, a beautiful speech, a beautiful service. 3 weeks after which he had a massive stroke and never spoke again. And he
Oh
spent the
man.
last 15 years of his life unable to communicate. And I,
15 years.
15
Holy
years,
cow.
15
Oh
years.
no.
It was unclear to all of us the degree to which he was 100% himself in there or dazed and, just smiling when on cue. And it was impossible to know. I, I became and still am obsessed with this idea of like, if he could talk, if he tried to say what mattered to him, what would he do and how would he do it? And I think the my answer to that is he would
So this
look
is
at
really
the
like a letter of love to your
it
teacher, this
it
novel.
it absolutely is. It's a way of trying to give him a way of saying I I exist and I mattered and this is how I feel he would do it. I feel he would do it by telling the story of his students who are out
Yeah.
there in the world. So you asked initially about the knock knock jokes, and I didn't want a reader coming into this book thinking it was going to be a sad sack love story, a sad sack wheelchair guy who's can't talk, and we have to diving bell and butterfly his way through the horrors of life. I wanted him to be an entertainer in the same way he was when he could entertain. So that's why
Hmm.
he's telling jokes. He wants to say like my students matter, my wife matters, I matter, and you, the reader, matters here. So I'm going to be in my mind, I am going to be trying to entertain you while explaining why this job of teacher and student is, one of the most important jobs one can have.
I appreciate what you were saying about also the ways that, teachers, fiction is full of conflict and literature is full of teachers behaving badly. And to have that rehabilitated a bit, like all of the characters you're describing, they're quite, um, there's a lot of sweetness in the book and a lot of people being good. And that is also realistic. And sometimes my own students or other people, other writers I'm speaking with will sort of wonder, like, how do I do that? And this is a really nice example of that. I was thinking of like Mr. Holland's Opus,
Right.
but also, yeah,
I
like
forgot about
just
that one.
the
So did
yeah,
I.
I think that I mean, I was a musician and I loved watching that movie because I loved my band teachers.
Is this
And
this thing about you being able to play instruments that you're going on
he
about
doesn't
again?
believe me.
I,
It's a great subplot of the whole,
she claims that
podcast arc.
she's in
Whitney's
a
Whitney's
jazz
teachers
band
taught him
that doesn't exist and all
Whitney's
kinds of
Whitney's
things.
teachers taught him skepticism. But so like I mean, right,
Oh,
this
during the
novel
times
is
that you used music, you learned music, he learned skepticism. Was there that
Yeah,
same period?
he was
that
like,
was what Ed taught.
how can I suck joy out of things? But so this book is also about like it's not just about how Mr. Keating remembers his students, it's also about how his students remember him. And often I think teachers don't necessarily know what kind of impact they have. There's one thing about like, how a student's career looks. And you know, like one of my memories of one of my favorite teachers was the moment that she scolded me for like not raising my hand. And also she's still one of my favorite teachers, but like why would
Yeah,
probably didn't remember that. Um, so I don't know, as you're thinking about writing about this character, how did you think about like the uncertainty in that as teachers think about their students? Like you came back to Mr. Keating, right? And so many students don't return in the way that you did. The teacher doesn't know how they're remembered. And maybe not they don't only want that public success, but they also want maybe the student to look back and be like, oh, that teacher was transformative.
absolutely, absolutely. And I mention it. I put this thought briefly in Mr. Keating's voice in the novel. But I feel it so profoundly. Where I've been teaching eighth grade now for almost 20 years, and the moments when the students come back to visit or when I see them in the street, I just dread those moments. I hate it. I I see the older version of the child to whom I meant so much when they were in eighth grade and who meant so much to me. And now we're just people standing there next to each other, shaking hands and, do you still play volleyball, or, how's your sister doing? And it like what we both want to say at that moment is like, remember how much we meant to each other. Like remember what we had, and how fun it was, and how, the word special is sort of cringy, but like how special it felt in that moment. And it doesn't exist anymore. And the student has had 100 other teachers, and I've had 1,000 other students. And there's something about holding on to the memory of those intense months that one spends with a student, or one spends with a teacher, when it really does matter, those conversations, pointing someone in a direction to love literature, to think of oneself as capable, or to speak up more often in class, or to find the way that language can come together and form an essay, or, articulate a vision of the world. It's the, the break of, or the disconnect between the intensity of that moment, and then 10 years later, when you're awkwardly shuffling your weight with your hands in your pockets, seeing somebody again, is painful in some way, but just reminds, I think, both teacher and student of how important those relationships were when they occurred. And that's something that Mr. Keating in this book is dealing with in a variety of ways. In Jacob, whom he keeps closer, and Clara, whom he watches from afar, and in just memories of everyone else in these formative years of his life.
The other interesting social force in the book is like the educational system. St. George's is the fictional private school where your fictional Mr. Keating teaches, but you teach at Grace Church School in New York,
I
whose
do.
notable alumni include, according to Wikipedia, David Duchovny, David Brooks, Matthew Iglesias, and you now, or
And
maybe
me.
always.
Yeah.
Um, I'm assuming that Grace Church, I don't know that school, is an exclusive, expensive school like St. George's in the novel. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the whole New York private school scene and the effect it has on students like Clara, who isn't as wealthy as the others, not to mention students who never have a chance to attend a school like that.
I mean, it's a deeply complicated question that I've spent a whole lot of time thinking about, and that I probably won't be able to do justice to in a soundbite. But they're just too expensive. Like the
Yeah,
problem with these schools is that they're just too expensive. And there's not, except for avenues, like these aren't for-profit organizations. It's not like there's some fat cat on top reaping the benefits of the finances of all of this. But to have small classes in New York City real estate, where you have, insurance and like fancy lunches, these things cost a comically absurd amount of money.
yeah.
And when I attended them, they were absurd, but maybe not comically absurd. Like we had, like my father was like a kind of unsuccessful lawyer, and there was like, dentists and magazine editors who send their kids there, and it was a big sacrifice, but we were the children of professionals in New York City, essentially. Now, to afford the 70 plus $1,000 a year in tuition, this is after tax money, of course, plus a couple kids, means that you need to be able to have just an extra 150, $180,000 sitting around each year to pay for. And that means that the people who can afford to attend these schools come from a small cadre of society. And the schools do their best, and they really sincerely do their best to try to provide as much financial aid as possible, and to, bring in a variety of students. And it's not pure tokenism, but there is an anxiety that everybody feels in these schools, where to say that this product is worth 70 plus $1,000 a year means that you're changing what education looks like, and parents become consumers as much as just parents. And schools are trying to promise, not only entrance into colleges, but life-changing experiences that are really hard to guarantee to an eighth grader in math class who's struggling with, what a parabola is. It's gotten priorities all out of whack. So to answer your question, what does it mean to show up and to be a kid like Clara, who doesn't come from the same means that your classmates
Seems
it
like
it
it warps her a little bit in
it,
the
it
novel,
right.
anyway.
It makes you lonely, it makes you competitive, it makes you feel like you need to define yourself at a far too young of an age where, a seventh, eighth grade girl, boy, anybody shouldn't feel the need to define oneself. But there's the idea that like I'm with the kings of queens of the world, and I want to show that I belong, or I feel like I don't, or I want to prove that I'm better. And there's competition built in early. There's do I belong here built in early, and there's the other side of it where families who can afford to pay, kids, parents, everybody are feeling like, what are you, school? What are you, teacher, giving me that's worth $73,000 a year? And it's an unanswerable question from all these perspectives. So it makes the experience fraught in a way that I don't think anybody knows how to deal with.
There's an NYU uh, economics professor named Scott Galloway, and I heard him say recently on a
Sure.
podcast that, all right, parents, if you feel bad that your kid didn't get into Dalton, just imagine if you took that $70,000 that it would cost for you to educate them for middle school and upper school, and just invested it in an S&P 500 fund. By the time they're 35, you can give them $3.5 million or some insane figure like that, you know.
I
So
totally,
my
but but
kids
I
go to
but
private
to
school
say
too. They go to a version of St. George's in Kansas City, which was the same school that I went to, and it also you're robbing the public education infrastructure, and I actually think it's bad for rich kids to go to school with other rich kids. I think the rich kids actually don't benefit from going to schools like Pembroke. They would have been better off getting their asses kicked in public school for a little while. And the private schools are actually do best. The kids who aren't from means probably get the most out of those schools, in my personal view.
I agree with some of that, disagree with others. Just to go to Galloway for a second. I think what he's missing is that people don't want to give their kids $3.5 million. People
Yeah,
want to give their kids something else, right?
that's
And
right.
what they
That's what I
think,
chose.
right, and what they think they're giving their kids is the Ulysses class that you and I took, in when we were young enough that it was all extraordinary to us, but that we were old enough to start to digest it. And also what they want to give their kids is the world of they want to give I want to give my kids everything that they could possibly see and learn and be and do. And when you say the local public school is gonna kick their ass, like I think we want to define ass kicking a little bit. And that's what I thought before I visited the local, school in Bed-Stuy um where my kids would end up, where I mentioned the incarceration rate and graduation rate are comparable, and the lunches are made out of cardboard, and the classes have 36 kids in them. And like, what version of ass kicking am I actually wanting my kid to show up and experience every day? And I just don't know what the answer to that is. So, like, do people like you and me sending our kids to private school gut the public school system? 100% yes. There is no morally acceptable explanation for my sending my kids to independent school.
Yeah,
That being said, I'm sending my kids to independent school because I have access to it, because I teach there, and because I feel like
it's better. I
they
in
are.
the end, you become very selfish with your
That's
children.
the
You
thing.
know.
I'm a hypocrite. My politics do not align with my pedagogical vision for my children. And it's same thing, but my also professional. Like I could I should be teaching at these schools, right? Like it's not just where I'm sending my schools, it's where I'm choosing to teach. Like my sister is the principal of a charter school up in the South Bronx, and she is really putting her money where her mouth is, or her mouth where her politics are, or whatever I mean by that. And her experience is fundamentally different from mine, and far more noble and far less intellectually joyful. And I don't know what to make of that.
I live in the great Socialist Republic of Minnesota. Um, and I send um my children are in Minnesota public schools. And I should say that they're my stepdaughters, and that was also that was primarily their parents' decision. And also I I don't know. Yeah, like I'm glad you said the ass kicking thing, because I too kind of wanted to bear down on the question of what that means. I went to a public school. I went to a public school in a rich district. And so it kind of functioned like a private school.
Yeah, I don't mean
And
physically getting beat up. I
I
mean
know,
Yeah.
I know.
taking
We're
learning to be around people from a different class and adopting and understanding that they have a role in your life too and listening to their point of view.
And there's
Yeah,
value
Um,
for
to
sure.
that, but also learning, like, again, we're weighing all of these goods, these sort of, we're all raising kids and we all want them to learn certain skill set. And, when I sort of rolled my eyes when we were in the land of grit 15 years ago, where grit is the only thing that matters because of, Angela Duckworth's speeches on it. But grit is important. And when you say getting their ass kicked, like, the schools where we are sending our kids are going to kick their asses intellectually in a way that, other schools might not. And I just think it's really complicated.
Well, we could clearly debate this part for a while.
Sugi, I think we should sign off here,
Yeah.
by the way. Okay.
Okay.
Will you count in and do that?
Sure. Well, Brian, we could clearly talk about this for a while, but yeah, we want to thank you so much for joining us today. We'll bring you back for our next educational rant episode. And in the meantime, congratulations on the publication of this novel, and we encourage listeners to pick up The Optimists at an independent bookstore near them.
This was such a treat. Thank you both so much.